Welcome to our British survey from the beginnings of British literature to the present. Today I want to take you on a journey into the 19th century, which is in a certain way the most important century in English history because it sees a huge transformation of the country from an agricultural and aristocratic country into a modern industrial society. When we talk about the 18th century, we talk about good old England, and you might read the term good old England. When we talk about the 19th century, we talk about the modern industrial state, and this is something completely different. Before we turn to literature, we have to understand this transformation and the machinery, the powers behind it, because it gives you an insight into how society works, which forces are at work to change it. And of course, we also have to talk about the political changes. You will know that the French Revolution happened in 1789, and England was always afraid that something similar could happen on the British island as well, but it didn't. We know it didn't, but nevertheless, what some people might not know is that England several times got to the brink of such a revolution. I will also be talking about this. In the 18th century, we have an aristocratic society dominated by the landowning class, because when I talk about agriculture, I mean aristocracy. They were the big landowners. Remember what I said about Edward III and his many sons? They were dividing about half of England between them. And when I say half of England, I mean land, of course. Land produces agriculture, yields money, so to speak, and from the money the aristocracy lives. In the course of the 19th century, another source of money, so to speak, sprung up, and this is what we call capitalism. I will come back to this in a moment. The process I'm talking about is also called the process of transformation, that is also called the Industrial Revolution. Its beginnings reach back into the 18th century. I should say it starts around 1760, 1770, and it continues into the 19th century. It reaches its peak, its climax, around 1850-51, where we have the so-called Great Exhibition in London, in the Crystal Palace, first exhibition of its kind, which shows the industrialized nation, England, at the height of its power. So the Industrial Revolution begins 1760, 1770, and it is related to technological innovation, and here especially to the invention of steam power and machinery. Well, you will have heard about James Watt and his steam engine, and I have heard about that as well when I was young, a student of English literature, but I couldn't understand why an industrial revolution could be kicked off by steam power, just by steam power or a steam engine. I couldn't understand that. I had a steam engine myself as a child, you know, playing with it. But how can a steam engine transform a whole country? Well, the steam engine was used in many different ways, and it kicked off a process of technological innovation that became productive in such a way that at the end stood the factories and goods manufactured in big factories instead of being manufactured at home. By the way, the word manufacture reminds you that it was handiwork, because the word manu comes from the Latin. Manus means the hand, craft, that is. Manufacture, industrial manufacture, however, is related to factories, no longer at home, but to factories. On my screen, you see two examples of this technological innovation kicked off by the steam engine. The first is the locomotive on the left, and the second is the spinning jenny. The spinning jenny, not yet powered by steam. Later on it was powered by steam. So you had steam-powered spinning machines as the Industrial Revolution went on. Now, the railway was already an advanced sign of the application of steam power. When people first began to use steam power, they used it for machines, stationary steam engines in, for example, coal mines or iron mines, which pulled the coal wagons and iron wagons out of the mines, or which pulled elevators. Elevators conveying people from the depths of the earth to the surface, or coal conveying coal from the mines to the surface of the earth. And these steam engines, they were stationary, till somebody hit upon the idea, well, why not construct a steam engine that can be mobile, that is moving itself by its own power, you know? And this was the idea of the locomotive engine, and from this sprang the railway. Now, why are railways so important? It is not enough to construct just a locomotive. First, railways in England started to be driven between Darlington, Liverpool and Manchester. That is the bigger one. What's the other town? Darlington and forgot the other name, I'm afraid. But Darlington Railway was the first one. It's interesting if you do some research on that, how the first railways were operated. Stockton is the second place, Stockton and Darlington. Not a very long one, but they had rails there, you know, and on the rails they put wagons, and on the wagons they had goods, usually coal, heavy things that could not be transported in wintertime over the roads, which were muddy, you know, so they put it on rails. First accidents happened on these railways because people also put their coach wagons drawn by horses on the rails without minding the locomotive engines. And whenever there was an encounter between a horse-pulled coach and a locomotive engine, you can imagine who was the winner. You know, well, in order to get past the obstacle, the coach usually had to be lifted from the rails, The engine, the locomotive, and the wagons had to pass by, and then the coach was lifted back on the rails. You know, that was the beginning of the railway in England, and you can imagine that this did not last very long. There were many accidents involving people and horses, and people stopped that after some time because it was no good to use horse-drawn coaches on rails. So the railways took or won the day after all, and the technology was developed further and further, and now you know what the railways look nowadays. At that time it was the steam-driven locomotive engine that counted, but of course the railways, in order to build railways you had to have a hell of a lot of iron and coal. You know, the rails consist of steel, and the engines need coal in order to be driven. So what happened as a consequence of the invention of the steam engine and the railway was the heavy industry. Heavy industry was boosted because they needed a lot of coal, they needed a lot of iron in order to manufacture all the rails, in order to manufacture all the engines themselves, you know. This gave an additional sort of drive to the Industrial Revolution. And soon the steam engines were used not only for railways but also in the weaving industry that was situated in the north of England. How does weaving begin? You know the fairy tales where the daughter of a king is sitting at her spinning wheel, spinning a thread, you know, and then sort of pricking herself with a spinning needle and falling asleep. Well, this is what spinning looked like before the engines were invented. What you see here on the right of my screen is already a technologically advanced spinning apparatus. You see the spinning jenny. Spinning jenny became very famous because you could spin much more wool by the spinning jenny than before with the spinning wheel, you know, a simple spinning wheel. Because later on the spinning jenny was developed having more than just wheel. You see the wheel on the screen. If you have many wheels one by one, you see you can spin a hell of a lot of wool. Spinning means actually turning sheep wool into wool that can be knitted into a pullover and so on and so on. You still haven't got any cloth. For cloth weaving you needed weaving apparatus, you needed weaving machines, and all these machines, they were later on driven by steam power. And you can imagine that such steam-driven spinning and weaving apparatuses, this is the beginning of the cloth industry in England, and England became famous for its cloth, especially the area around Manchester, for example, towards the north of England. As the north of England as such became the area in England that was industrialized first. So when we talk about the Industrial Revolution and the factories springing up, we talk about the north of England. The south of England, perhaps with the exception of London, stayed fairly rural, stayed agrarian, you know. You have a hell of a lot of nice nature and landscape in the south. And when you travel from the south in the 19th century, when you travel from the south into the north, you suddenly see the factories springing up, you see a lot of what Charles Dickens later on in his novel Hard Times would call unparliamentary smoke. Unparliamentary because there was an act of parliament that forbade the issue of smoke from the chimneys of the factories to a certain degree. To a certain degree, of course, the Industrial Revolution brought with it the problem of pollution. Pollution of the air, pollution of the water, pollution of human beings who worked in the factories. And this is, when we talk about pollution, we actually talk about the first half of the 19th century, where this environmental problem or these environmental problems were very great indeed. So the north of England industrialized, the south of England still agrarian, with the exception of the city of London, which grew a lot. The towns in the north also grew a lot because of the industry that sprang up. All the towns that might be known to you via famous English football clubs. Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle, Preston. Well, Preston is not so famous as a football club, but they also have a second or third division team. Birmingham, of course, and in the north, Glasgow in Scotland. That's Scotland already. Glasgow. All these are industrial towns that grew into their size in the course of the 19th century. Pollution as one problem, poverty and other social problems should also be mentioned. The workers started flocking into these big industrial cities in the north because they had heard that there were a hell of a lot of jobs being created. Not all of the workers, of course, were happy with the steam-powered machinery. The handloom weavers, for example, they were afraid of losing their jobs. Can imagine if you are a handloom weaver, you want to earn your money as well as soon as the steam engine has arrived. Hard luck, you can't sort of compete with machinery at your handloom, so you have to give up your job. Quite a number of handloom weavers became jobless. As there was the great anxiety that the machines could sort of create an army of unemployed workers. That is an anxiety that is very similar to our anxiety nowadays. Nowadays we are afraid that the computer and information technology will steal our jobs. In the 19th century it was steam power and technological invention that were feared. But as we know nowadays, although there are some jobs that are lost, like those of the handloom weavers in the 19th century, or some of the jobs lost nowadays, some secretary jobs are lost, the scribe is no longer there, people who copy manuscripts have lost their jobs because the computers can do it better. Although we know that this fear is there, it is not justified, because also at the same, in the same moment a host of new jobs is being created by technological invention. And that was of course also the case in the 19th century. Although some people protested against this railway engine, against the steam powered machinery by breaking the machines. Their name is Luddites. according to their leader, General Ladd. The Laddites were machine breakers in the second decade of the 19th century. They tried to break all the new machinery. They devastated some factories, and of course they were taken to prison for that. Although these people protested heavily against this new technology, it was of no use, of course, because technology won the day after all. The railway developed and other technological invention. Later on, the steam-powered boat and ship was developed in England, especially in the second half of the 19th century. And, well, the Titanic is one great example of such a steam-powered ship. Nowadays we have other sources of energy, even on ships. We have uranium, and we have electricity that was invented later. Those are the sources of power nowadays. And, well, I have to come back to the 19th century. The face of England changed. You will have understood completely. It was a different England. Some people actually talked about the two Englands, the industrialized north and the agrarian south. There is a novel by Elizabeth Gaskell called North and South, or the subtitle of the novel Sybil by Benjamin Disraeli, who was British Prime Minister at some time in the 19th century. Sybil, or The Two Nations, also tells you about this split of the nation into an agrarian one and an industrial one. The political system, as often is the case, and here especially the system of suffrage and voting and representation in Parliament, this system did not change so quickly as England changed in the course of the 19th century. Up to 1831-32, I will say something about this date in a minute. Up to 31-32, England had stayed fairly stable, fairly similar over more than 150 years, namely from the reign of William of Orange and his wife Mary, 1688-89, the so-called Glorious Revolution. Up to 1831-32, there were no political changes in the political system of England. The aristocracy was dominant and ruled the country. The aristocracy, as you will remember, is the land-owning class. But now comes the Industrial Revolution, now come the big towns, you know. And, well, what happened at first? They had no representatives in Parliament. Parliament was still dominated by the aristocracy and by the landowners, while the great industrial captains with a lot of money in the background, they did not have a say as far as English politics were concerned. You see, and this is the situation in 1831-32, when I should maybe sometimes I should also change my screens. When in 31-32 there was the big reform where a lot of so-called rotten boroughs were abolished. Rotten boroughs who sometimes sent 1 or 2 representatives into Parliament and had only 50 or 60 people living there. Little villages sent their representatives to Parliament because it was the aristocrat who sent his sons there, who went there himself, you know. What you see here on my screen is a picture illustrating pollution. What you see here are satirical representations of the railway from a satirical journal called Punch, 1845. Railways have been in existence for 25 years. Remember Stockton, Darlington, the first English railway. Not very efficient, economically speaking. The more efficient one was Liverpool-Manchester. The Liverpool-Manchester Railway started to make money from 1830 onward. And in the course of the 19th century, the whole country was covered by railways. The railway juggernaut on the left, juggernaut means something like idol. People were praying to the railway because some people were convinced that railways were great inventions, you know, and they were praying to the railway. On the right, you see also the fear that the railway inspired, put in form of a cartoon. I come to dine, I come to sup, I come and come to eat you up. This is what you can read here on the cartoon, on the picture. And the English gentleman says, "Oh my beef and oh my babies." Oh the monster, he says, because the monster is eating his beef and maybe also swallowing his babies. I don't know why. Well, actually, railways were destroying the country to a certain extent. This is part of the topic of environmental pollution I talked about, because you had to cut through whole towns in order to lay the tracks for a railway. Neighbors were separated from each other because the railway was suddenly going through their districts, you know, and they could not visit each other. So the railway was destructive. Tunnels had to be built, bridges had to be built. I think you saw one of these bridges here on my screen. This is a bridge crossing the town. Can you imagine that? And look how ugly it looks. You see the factories in the foreground, you see the bridge in the background, and you also see the little railway on the bridge, you know. A little railway locomotive engine with some wagons. And this is from the Stockton and from Stockport on the Manchester and Birmingham Railway. That's one of the railways built after the Liverpool-Manchester Railway. From a contemporary engraving. You also see, or you can sense, the river in the foreground, and the river is polluted. Charles Dickens, the author, we are going to talk about in class. Charles Dickens writes about this when he writes about London. London was almost the only town in the south of England that was also industrialized. And London was polluted, the Thames was polluted by the Industrial Revolution. Let me come back to the First Reform Bill, 31-32. First Reform Bill means that the middle class that had come into existence in the course of the Industrial Revolution, all the workers, for example, the artisans, those, the weavers and the carpenters and all these people, they did not have a right to vote till 1831-32. From 1688-89, William of Orange, Glorious Revolution, to 1831-32, things remained unchanged. Parliament was occupied by aristocracy, and the middle class who came into existence, especially in the last 2 decades of the 18th century and in the first 3 decades of the 19th century, till 1831-32, the middle class was not represented. And now, through this First Reform Bill, the middle class in England became partly represented. Partly represented does not mean that everybody had the right to vote. Only those who earned more than £10 a year. £10 £10 a year was a hell of a lot of money at that time. Only those who earned more than £10 a year, they were allowed to vote. When I say those who earned £10 a year, I mean men and not women. Women were excluded from the vote in 31, 32, and somebody else was excluded from voting, namely the workers. When I talked about the threat of a revolution in England, similar to the French Revolution, 1789, this is the reason. The workers, a new class, came into existence in the first half of the 19th century. The working class. The working class goes back to the Industrial Revolution, goes back to the invention of steam power, goes back to all the technological inventions that came about in the first half of the 19th century. Because they needed workers. And the people, they migrated from the country into the big industrial towns. And there they worked in factories. But they had no political representation whatsoever. Up to the year 1867, when we have the Second Reform Bill. 1867, the Second Reform Bill. And now the working class, the workers got the right to vote. Now, you will ask me, what about women? Well, the women still had to wait. The women did not get the right to vote. When we talk about Jane Austen and marriage, we talk about the second decade of the 19th century, we talk about not so much the Romantic age. Jane Austen is a realist, sort of. When we talk about Jane Austen's novels, marriage becomes such an important topic. And do you know why? Because that was the only opportunity for women to realize themselves in the sense of making or gaining or acquiring some status in life, having a position in life, to be a housewife, to be the wife of a well-off partner. That was almost the only possibility, with the exception of becoming a governess, that's the name. A governess was a private teacher to the kids of an aristocratic family or a middle-class family, well off. A governess. The other opportunity was for unmarried women was to go into a monastery or a nunnery, to be more precise, and she could become an old spinster, sitting behind the hearth of her father's home, you know, and thinking of good old days and maybe shedding tears over the one man in her life that was loved by her. So, an old spinster, a nun in a nunnery, a governess, not a very attractive job for a woman because governesses were non-entities in the sense of they were not recognized as far as their social standing was concerned. If the family gathered around the table, the governess was either excluded or she was ignored. Her presence was ignored. She was not recognized as an important part of the family. And the only socially acceptable role for a woman was to become married. And this explains why Jane Austen is so keen on marriages and that the marriage goes well, that marriages function well. That is her point, you know, because otherwise the woman would be undone. Especially if she, as Lydia does, thinks of an elopement, an illegal sort of thing for a woman to elope with a man, to become his mistress. She would be socially completely annihilated if she did that. And Lydia almost has this fate in Pride and Prejudice, as you know. Back to the question of suffrage and back to the right to vote. In the 19th century, women were excluded up to the year 1918. After the First World War, women were given the right to vote. But only those women above the age of 30 could vote in 1918. And in 1928, finally, as late as that, 90 years ago, all women were allowed to vote, all women in the sense of women above the age of 21. Nowadays we have 18 as the coming of age, but at that time it was 21. So it took England till 1928 to give women the right to vote. And the right to vote means political representation, of course, representation in Parliament, the right to stand for a post, a job, you know, as politician, and so on and so on. So women had a tough life up to that point. Back to 1831-32, representation in Parliament was changed. Aristocracy lost their part of their representation. Of course, the House of Lords remained the House of Lords, and in the House of Lords you have the high aristocrats. Till nowadays, that remains the same, you know. But the House of Commons is nowadays a representation of all classes in England. And this is the process that started 1831-32. And this is an important date insofar as it helped avoid a revolution in England. Otherwise, we might have had a revolution in England. There was a lot of social unrest, especially in the first half of the 19th century. And the workers were on strike at times. They were protesting. They had come together in what we call the People's Charter. They had drawn up a chart, meaning some sort of document which stated, like the American Declaration of Independence stated, that all people should be allowed to vote, and the workers included. The People's Charter, and there was a lot of social agitation of a political kind. There were protests and strikes and marches, you know, and at first the authorities reacted with violence, as they usually do. When people start to demonstrate, the authorities resort to violence, and this was also the case in England. But England had its reforms, and 1831, 32 and 1867 are important dates as far as the political reformation of suffrage, that is the right to vote, in England is concerned. On my screen here you see the machine breakers, the Luddites, you know. You also see how Luddites are spelled. The German word means machine stormer, those who storm the machines, storm the factories and break the machines. Wages were, generally speaking, very low in the first half of the 19th century. It picked up a bit in the second half. In the first half it was sometimes really, really bad. And the workers had to live in slum-like settlements. There was a hell of a lot of disease and criminality that spread swiftly across these slums. And this is something you also see in the townships in South Africa nowadays, for example, criminality, drug abuse, everywhere, the murder rate is high. All this happened in England in the first half of the 19th century. And this has to do with this change, this big change of the country from an agrarian country where people live isolatedly in the southern landscape of England towards this amassing of people in the big cities such as Liverpool, Manchester, Preston, Newcastle, and what have you. Another nice incident of the times, or another point to remember, is the so-called Corn Law, which was passed in 1815 for the benefit of the land-owning aristocracy. It illustrates why the majority of the people in England were so discontent in the first half of the 19th century. Because the Corn Law was actually a tax on corn. To be more precise, there were quite a number, hundreds of taxes on goods that were to the benefit of the aristocracy. Why are corn taxes to the benefit of the aristocracy? Well, you know, aristocracy, that's the land-owning class. They owned the land in England. They produced the corn. And they wanted to keep the corn prices high. And this means that all the corn that was imported from the continent was taxed by the authorities, which kept the corn prices high. Which meant that the aristocracy could line their pockets with the money they earned from selling expensive corn. Now, there was a whole new class that wanted to have cheap bread and cheap corn, and that was the working class. So the corn laws were actually benefiting the aristocracy, but they were directed against the working class, because the working class were not interested in high corn prices, they were interested in cheap bread. By the way, here you have a parallel to the French Revolution. Part of the reasons for the French Revolution, as you know, is the bread prices going up, you know. And, well, so something similar was happening in England. But as I told you, England could avoid a revolution while France could not. This is why England still has an aristocracy nowadays. This is why we have Prince Andrew and Prince William. And who are the ladies along with them? You know, you see them in the yellow journals, yellow papers, you know, all the time. And the greatest interest seems to be whether one of them is pregnant again or not. I'm not talking about Prince William and Prince Andrew in this context, but about their ladies. An aristocratic society, yeah, but working class society as far as the working power in the 19th century is concerned. An anti-corn law league in the 19th century first half protested against the corn laws, and there were also violent attempts to stifle or to distinguish this protest. The Peterloo Massacre from 1819 is a good example, where quite a number of women and children who were amongst the protesters were killed by the English government, sending troops in to quell the protest. You can read up all of this on my screens on the teaching platform, where you find it in a lecture titled 19th Century Literature. What I give you here is the background, the political, social, economic background to the literature that we are going to read. I'm contextualizing what I'm doing. This is my approach, you know, not just read literature with you, but put the literature into context. That is the skill of the literary scholar. This is what you have to learn. Not just read a text and say what the text is about and relate it to the biography of the author, but put it into the context of its time. The big towns I mentioned, in 1750, just 2 towns with more than 50,000 inhabitants. In 1851, we have 29, and among these, more than 9 with 100,000 inhabitants. That was quite a lot for that time, for the 19th century. I know nowadays we have big towns of 10 millions and 20 millions even in China, or more than 10 million in England as far as London is concerned in the meantime, and so on and so on. Those of you who can read German, who can read German? Okay, for you too then. I'm sorry about that. That's a leftover from one of my lectures in Vienna, given in Vienna, where I quoted it in German. What it actually is about, and this is maybe the interesting point, it's about Friedrich Engels. Friedrich Engels came together with Karl Marx to England in order to study the effects and the consequences of the Industrial Revolution, of this process I have been talking about. They came, and Karl Marx wrote Das Kapital, the Capital, his most important work, in the library in London, in the British Library in London. If you want to follow in his footsteps, you might sort of go to London for a quick stay, for a week or so, and might sit down in the British Library to write your BA thesis in there. And you will have an Indian servant bringing you on a trolley the books you have ordered from the library, and also taking these books back. You sit down in the library and you are inspired by the spirit of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. If you want to be inspired by the spirit of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Maybe you don't want to be inspired by them, but of course Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels are very important as far as the history of communism is concerned. And the history of communism is part of the history of your country, as you know. You have wiggled free from that influence, I know, but this is part of the history you should know about. Engels wrote about the situation of the working class in England in 1845. And what you read here in my German text is a description of the awful circumstances under which these working class families had to live. And he describes the cottages, the damp cottages, and even the cellar rooms in which they had to live. He describes the pollution of the rivers. He describes the open sewers in which the children played. This is something you have seen in pictures about Africa, you know, where you have little children playing in the sewers, you know, and all the refuse of mankind is drifting past them, and they catch disease, you know, they become ill, and so on and so on. And this was the case in England in the first half of the 19th century, and this was the case according to Friedrich Engels in the big industrial cities in England in the first half of the 19th century. So we are not talking about something that is far away in an exotic country. We are talking about England. This is part of English history. Here you have again some of the acts that started to improve the lot of the workers. What I did not mention so far, people, women and children, they didn't have the right to vote, but they had the right to work. and women and children worked sometimes more than 10 hours a day, up to 14, 16 hours a day. Children at first were allowed to work 10 hours a day, and you can imagine how much power was left after 10 years of, after 10 hours of working for learning to read and to write, which means the working class could not read or write. They couldn't read any books, they couldn't read any newspapers. And the children, they were not going to school, but they were forced to work in coal and iron mines. And that is something terrible, of course. This is what we still have in developing countries, such in African countries, you know, where the children are sent into coal mines, or even iron mines, or diamond mines, you know. And they have to do hard work in there. No formal education whatsoever. The Great Exhibition of 1851 showed England at the height of its powers, you know. England, the first industrial nation of the world. Actually, that is true. England was the first industrialized nation of the world. We tend to forget that looking to America nowadays, but if you compare the development in England and that in America, you would have to say that in England the industrialization process picked up speed in the first half of the 19th century, while in America the industrialization process began in the second half, or picked up speed in the second half of the 19th century. England in 1851-52 was at the height of its power. America was just beginning. Other European countries were following England as far as the process of industrialization was concerned. And in the second half of the 19th century, the European nations such as Germany especially, but also France, they were overtaking England as far as the gross national product was concerned. And America came out first around the turn of the century, 19th to 20th century. America became the mightiest industrialized nation of the world, while in England the development was sort of hampered, or going back, going down. England was sort of sliding down the drain in many respects in the second half of the 19th century, and this had a lot of reasons, of course. One of the reasons is an interesting one. You will have heard about red brick universities. You know what a red brick university is? Well, you can start with the name. Red brick is used for building factories. And red brick universities that sprang up in the second half of the 19th century, they looked like huge factories. If you nowadays go to Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, you go to see red brick universities. Newcastle the same. They were built in the style of factories, and this is no small wonder, because, well, what was the university education system like in England in the 19th century? There were two ancient and dominant universities in England, and this is Cambridge, of course, and this is Oxford. Cambridge and Oxford, however, still had their emphasis on the humanities, on the arts, on the fine arts, you know, and they ignored natural sciences at first. That's my point. You have a highly industrialized nation in the 19th century, and you have Oxford and Cambridge teaching Homer or teaching Terence and Plautus and the classics, reading Greek and reading Latin, but not teaching how to build a ship, not teaching how to develop a railway, you see. So many of the towns that had sprung up in the north of England in the course of the 19th century decided to have their own universities. Universities which put their emphasis on the natural sciences instead of the humanities, instead of the fine arts. And if you have a look at the English university landscape nowadays, you still have Oxford and Cambridge, of course, and Oxford and Cambridge still have a big emphasis on the humanities. And you have a hell of a lot of universities with an emphasis on the natural sciences, especially in the north of England. And this has come about historically, because the big towns, they needed engineers. They didn't need doctors of philosophy. That's always nice when I go to a doctor and they see I am a doctor of, well, Dr. Phil is not part of my name, so I'm just Dr. Mengel. And they keep asking me, what sort of doctor are you? They are careful because they don't want to make a mistake in my presence. They think I'm a medical doctor. And I always say, you need not be afraid of me. I'm a doctor of philosophy and I earn less money than you do. Yes, this is how I make friends with doctors. The Dr. Phil and the Dr. Rerum Naturalis, as it is in Latin, two different worlds, two different categories. They needed engineers, they needed shipbuilders, they needed railway engineers, and Oxford and Cambridge could not cater for them. So they built their own universities. Red brick, because they were built from red bricks and they look like factories. If you have gone to Cambridge and Oxford, you will see nice sandstone buildings. All the colleges in Oxford and Cambridge, they are built from sandstone. They are not built from red brick. Sandstone is of course much more expensive than red brick. If you want to build a university quickly, you would build it in red brick. You wouldn't build it in sandstone. I don't know, what sort of university are we in here? I think it's neither red brick nor is it sandstone. It's probably good old concrete. But that's the modern way of building universities. I quite like these rooms and this lecture hall because that's state of the art, and you should be glad and should be proud to be able to study in here. I'm saying that for the camera, of course. Okay, time to resume. One last thing about the political, economic developments in England concerns the British colonies, and here especially the continent of Africa. Towards the end of the 19th century, England, who had been growing by acquiring colonies all over the world from the 17th century onwards, got some rivals as far as colony building was concerned. And the also industrialized European states such as Germany or France and Spain, Italy, they all went for new colonies. Africa becomes important in this context. There was a Berlin conference, a conference in 1883 or 5, I'm not quite sure. 1800, let's call it 85, maybe it's 83, haven't got it on my sheets. There was a Berlin conference where all the European powers met and decided to distribute Africa amongst themselves. That's a nice idea, isn't it? Africa is obviously a continent that is not inhabited by other people, so the Europeans may be marching in and found their colonies. On the left of my screen you see a colored map of the countries that were founding colonies in Africa. You see the light blue, that is France. You see the ochre or yellow patches, brown yellow patches, that's Great Britain or England. You see the red patches, that's Germany. You see the dark blue patches, that's Italy, and Portugal is also, no sorry, the green ones are Italy and Portugal is the dark blue one. You see the whole of the continent of Africa was divided amongst the European powers. Most of them kept their colonies into the 60s and the 70s of the 20th century, when most of the colonies regained their independence from the European powers. Now, why do the European powers, those industrialized nations that come about in the 19th century, why do they need colonies? The reason is, of course, and the explanation is, colonies are important with regard to natural resources. You can import wool and wood and tea and coffee and diamonds and gold from the colonies. That's one reason, natural resources. And of course, an industrialized nation needs a hell of a lot of natural resources. Oil is a fairly recent discovery. And the one who is the greediest with regard to oil is, of course, America. In the present, wherever there is oil, there is America. And there is war, because America wants to have the oil, and there are others who compete for the oil. The second reason why colonies become important in a more and more global market is, of course, that you could export your industrial goods into the colonies. The colonies were inhabited by people who could hopefully pay for what they imported. So the market boundaries were extended. And this is important because a capitalist economy has to grow. Of course, the colony builders, they did not argue in this way. They claimed that they wanted to bring light and enlightenment and wisdom and manners and civilized customs into a dark continent. On the left, at the bottom, you see a remark by Cecil Rhodes. I contend that we are the finest race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. These words could have come straight off Donald Trump's mouth nowadays. See my point? Make Britain great because we are the finest race in the world. As soon as we have arrived anywhere, we bring enlightenment and wisdom and knowledge and tea time. Cecil Rhodes, you see him in a cartoon on the right of my screen. a cartoon called From Cape to Cairo, was the archetypal empire builder, the archetypal British empire builder. He was important as far as the British African colonies were concerned, and of course he's the name giver for the former Rhodesia. Rhodesia has its name after Cecil Rhodes. Nowadays it's called Zimbabwe, as you know. People have gone back to an original native name. You see him here straddling a continent, and Cecil Rhodes was dreaming of a railway that could connect Cairo in Egypt. Egypt was an English colony at some time into the 40s of the 20th century, to Cape Town in South Africa. South Africa, as you can see, together with Botswana and Rhodesia, was a British colony. A railway built along the eastern coastline, more or less the eastern coastline of Africa. You can see that this railway would have been built almost entirely through British-owned colonies, with the exception of the red patch south of the Victoria Lake, Lake Victoria. That's a German colony. It contains the states of Uganda, Tanzania nowadays. These are the countries south of the Victoria Lake. They would have to build a railway around that, or maybe they could agree with the Germans to build it through the colony. Why is such a railway important? Of course, Africa is a hell of a great continent, you know, and if you want to transport goods, if you want to transport natural resources, you would have to do it on the landway by the help of railways in the 19th century. Of course, you could also transport it by ship, but ships were slow at that time, before the invention of the steam-powered ship, you know, and ships were also dependent on the winds and on the weather. Ships were open to attacks from pirates and so on and so on. So the railway seemed to be a good idea. Also, you could send troops in quickly, of course. If you build a railway through your colonies, you can send in troops quickly in order to stifle any protest. This is why railways are also important in the colonies. Strategically speaking, they are an important part of not only building power in the colony, but also staying in power in the colony. I have not said anything about the new ideas that sprang up in the 19th century, and this is also interesting, and this is also important. Those of you who have been with me from the beginning of my lecture know that knowledge is not something that is there for one and all times. Knowledge keeps changing. What people understand to be knowledge keeps changing. In order to give an example from our time, our knowledge nowadays is based on information and on the computer. That's the type of knowledge that seems to be most akin to our time. In the Middle Ages, knowledge was collected by the Bible, by the stories of the Bible, and the kind of new knowledge that is important for the natural sciences is, of course, a different sort of knowledge. In the 19th century, it's a sort of knowledge that is based on sense perception, on experience, and on experiment. All these things are rejected by the Bible. Bible says you only must believe and you know everything you need to know. But of course the scientist is not satisfied with that sort of advice. The scientist is searching for new knowledge, and in literature you have the big figures such as Dr. Faustus, who crave for knowledge beyond human ken. And this is their sin, this is their superbia, and this is why Dr. Faustus is punished, because he is craving for a type of knowledge that was reserved to be God's. In the 19th century, one idea especially became important, and I want to tell you which idea this is, and it's the idea of evolution. You might have heard about Charles Darwin and his book on the origin of species. It was conceived, the idea for this book was conceived in the 30s and 40s, but it was published as late as the 50s of the 19th century, and this had a certain reason, because Darwin was afraid that his ideas would shake the world, so to speak, to its foundations, and they did, actually. He was a biologist, but the idea of evolution is not restricted to the idea of biology. It also plays a role in the field of astronomy, and here we have the Marquis De Laplace, who explained the birth of the solar system with the idea of evolution. He had his nebula hypothesis, which meant the stars are born by a gradual conglomeration, sort of amassing of nebular fogs in the course of billions of years. That's the idea of evolution. In the course of billions of years, from the fogs, from the dust, in the cosmos, we get the planets, which needs a temporal frame of about billions and trillions of years. And of course, this casts some doubt on the assumption of a singular and definite divine act of creation. In the Bible, we get to know that the world is 6,000 years old, and that God created, when he created, in the act of creation, he created everything. Yes. And the ideas of the scientists building on evolution, they go against this, because they need a much bigger temporal frame. They need billions of years for creation, for the things to come about. And this explodes the idea of a personal creator God, and explodes the idea of a time frame of just 6,000 years of age for the Earth. Laplace's pioneering study of astronomy and general physics postulated the universal rule of limited duration, and he also applied this idea to the solar system, which meant that he believed that the solar system was not made for eternity. Here you have the archaic motif, the mythic motif of the dying sun in a modern scientific gown, so to speak. And we know nowadays, we have this idea of entropy, of course, the heat within a system winding down, first exploded, sun first exploding and then becoming cold. This is the idea of limited duration. Our Earth will die at some point in time. You need not be afraid when you go home tonight. You will still alive. The Earth will continue to be there. but in billions of years this might be the case. So you need not be worried, because you will not be an eyewitness of that incident. But that is the dimension in which these evolutionary thinkers are thinking in terms of time. The idea of evolution in astronomy, the idea of evolution also spread out in the field of geology. And here we have the famous scientist Charles Lyell with his Principles of Geology, who built on the idea of evolution. Lyell claims that the surface forms of the Earth and the shape of the continents continually change through erosion. Erosion meaning the influences of water, wind, volcanoes, and earthquakes. And his theory was based on the assumption that the universe had been existing for billions of years. Again, this idea that the universe is much older than the Bible says. And this shifted the beginnings of mankind back into a prehistoric past that was hardly imaginable. Nobody can imagine what it means to be shifted back for billions of years, you know. The one evolutionist you might have heard about is Charles Darwin, on the Origin of Species, 1859. Conceived earlier in the 30s and 40s, when Darwin was conducting his voyages on the Beagle, the ship Beagle, to South America. Darwin claimed that the system of species is continually evolving, that older species die out and new species come into existence, and that life on Earth evolved from simple forms and grew into more and more complex ones. And this opened people's eyes for the consequences of the concept of evolution. Because, once again, if you go to the Bible, if the Bible is your only source of knowledge, we've talked about the forms of knowledge, this is a different form of knowledge, obviously, and it's competing with the knowledge of the Bible. If you go back to the Bible says, man is God's creation, and man created God as his likeness. I don't know whether he knew about Donald Trump, and I think he would be more hesitating here. I'm sorry about that. But I keep throwing in these remarks because I keep reading about this guy, and the only thing is shaking one's head about what he does. Life on Earth evolved from simple forms and grew into more complex ones, and finally at the end we have the human being. The Victorians were deeply shaken by this idea of evolution and by the conclusion that mankind, endowed with mind, reasoning, and consciousness, should also be nothing but a product of an evolutionary process, determined by the laws of a mindless and mechanistic causality. Now, something comic, there was a lot of polemics against this, especially from the side of the church, you know. Church did not like these ideas at all. The philosopher T.H. Huxley, for example, who admired Charles Darwin, was asked by the sharp-tongued Bishop Wilberforce, Bishop of the Anglican Church, "Are you descended from an ape, Mr. Huxley, from your mother's or your father's side?" That's a nice one, isn't it? A nice diatribe against Huxley. And John Ruskin, the famous Victorian sage. John Ruskin is a great name. We don't get to know him in our classes and not in my lecture, but he is a real great figure in the Victorian age. He said, a bit resignedly, he remarked, You can't wash the slugs, that's the snails. You can't wash the slugs out of letters without disrespect to your ancestors. Nice one. I like these because they tell you how shaken the Victorians were. Yes, they were shaken so that the initial optimism that dominated the Victorian period up to the years 1850-51, an optimism that found its expression in the great exhibition in the Crystal Palace in London in 1851. This optimism gradually was broken, and since economy was also sliding down, we have the second half of the 19th century as an age that is much more pessimistic than the first half. And the ideas based on evolution I talked about helped to shake the Victorians out of their initial optimism and make them see reality with other eyes. Okay, this was the historical part of my lecture. For the last 10 minutes, I want to talk about the novel and the kind of novels you meet in the 19th century. In the classes, we shall read two novelists, namely Jane Austen and Charles Dickens. You have to keep all I have said at the back of your mind. This is the context in which we place our novelists. Okay, I have to change my foils now. Right. A novelist we shall not talk about is Walter Scott. We have talked about the Gothic novel in the second half of the 18th century, and Walter Scott in a way builds on the Gothic novel because he also writes about history, and in his novels also old castles turn up as the setting. You see on my screen Walter Scott, but you also see The Heart of Midlothian, a pencil sketch of Edinburgh, part of Edinburgh. Walter Scott is the first real historical novelist in England. What did he do? He claims in Waverley, a novel from 1813, what he claims is that he did the same as Horace Walpole, seek exotic historical settings. The exotic hereby means the past, settings in the past, but and write about these settings and the past, but not with the ingredient of the supernatural that you met in The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole, but without the supernatural, because he believes that history is exotic enough. And if you just talk about history, if you represent history in this way, history as such will seem exotic. In Heart of Midlothian, Scott talks about Edinburgh and a group of Puritan Covenanters and their manners. The concept of manners is a good one at this point. Later on we shall talk about Jane Austen's novel of manners. The concept of manners goes back to Henry Fielding and the novel of the 18th century. I talked about Fielding shortly. Manners means the ways of behavior. You can imagine that Scottish Puritans, Calvinists behave in a much different way in comparison to an English aristocrat living in London. So this Heart of Midlothian is a novel about the Puritans living in Edinburgh, about a young woman who becomes pregnant out of marriage, you know, and about her, and usually these women were condemned to death. So the people were very hard on women as far as pregnancy, illegal pregnancy was concerned. If the woman could not produce her offspring, she had to die, because they assumed that they were murderers. In this case, the sister of the pregnant woman goes to London to beg a pardon from the Queen. And this is the plot, you know, that Walter Scott constructs. And the setting is Scotland at the beginning of the 18th century, the union with England of 1707. This is the historical background. In Waverley, we have the background of the Bonnie Prince Charles trying to regain the throne, the English throne, which was lost by his father, James II, who fled to France. And the Stuarts did not, they were not content with the situation. They tried to regain the throne by openly rebelling against the House of Hanover, the Hanoverian king, George II in this case. And the novel is set in the Highlands in Scotland. Have you been to the Highlands? Wonderful landscape, wonderful place. Have you been to Loch Ness? Have you seen the monster of Loch Ness? Well, I didn't see the monster of Loch Ness. I was occupied with my girlfriend at that time. Nice one. And we too, we wandered around Scotland and the Highlands and read Walter Scott's Waverley, a novel set describing the Battle of Culloden, for example, in 1746, where the Highlanders are set against the English army under George of Hanover. The exotic in history can be found in the exotic dresses of the warriors of the Highland army. They wear kilts, you know, they wear axes, and they fight in a barbarous style. That's the exotic according to Walter Scott. He is true to reality, he is true to history. These things did happen. The Highlanders turned against George of Hanover. All in all, you get a wonderful picture of Scotland in the 18th century, first half of the 18th century. Of course, you can also get a love story. Waverley is a wavering hero, wavering between two heroines. One is blonde and one is black. Whom does he marry? Do you know? The blonde one or the black one? The black one is more exotic and more attractive, of course, so he ends up marrying the blonde one. There's a whole philosophy behind this. In literature, the black ones are always more fascinating, more gypsy-like, you know, more exotic. And this is why they don't make good marriage partners. You have to marry the blonde one, in the novel at least. I'm not talking about myself. I'm married to a black one, I'm afraid. I'm not going into detail here. I'm sorry I had to wake you up at this point, because time has far progressed and a joke always wakes one up. I was always glad for a joke when, you know, there were other professors, you know, who kept lecturing and lecturing and, yes, lecturing and put the people to sleep, but that's not the idea of a lecture. I think you should keep awake and learn something positive. So the historical novel, one of the sub-genres of the novel in the 19th century. You can turn to the teaching platform and read up for yourself. You can read up the excerpts. This is where the hero Waverley realizes that he is on the wrong side. He sees the Highland associates in their kilts running down from the hill and says, hell, what do I do? What did I do? Sorry. Jane Austen, novel of manners means the behavior, the customs, the conventions of a certain class of people. With Jane Austen, it's usually the upper middle class and the lower gentry. Could also be higher gentry in the case of Darcy of Pride and Prejudice. A novel set in the provinces, a novel circumscribing a small crowd of people, but as if it is a miniature painting. Jane Austen tells us a lot about her time. She is writing in the time of Romanticism. Her novels all appear in the second decade of the 19th century. That's still Romanticism, if you like, but her novels are far from romantic if you leave aside the topic of love, which is a very romantic topic. But more important for Jane Austen is marriage. What has love to do with marriage? Yes, the answer is nothing. According to Jane Austen, and in this she proves a realist. We shall talk about Jane Austen in class, so I can skip her and sort of turn straight to some other novelists. Important before the context I sketched in is the so-called subgenre of the industrial novel. Elizabeth Gaskell was already mentioned by me. She has written this famous novel North and South, with the two Englands, the industrialized North and the agrarian South. And it's like coming from one country to a different country, all in all. Charles Dickens, whom we will turn to in class in a moment, is also a novelist who wrote an industrial novel, Hard Times, in which a worker, Stephen Blackpool, features as hero. This is something which you don't get very often, that you have a working class hero in the novel of the 19th century. It only happens later in the century, when we come to the naturalist novel. Naturalist novels usually have lower class heroes and heroines, but not the realist novel of the 19th century. Charlotte Bronte is a romantic novelist, you might call her, although she doesn't write in the time of Romanticism. She writes at the height of the Industrial Revolution, but you don't notice anything about that, because her novel is set in the countryside, to be more precise, on the Yorkshire moors, where she grew up. In Haworth. Haworth Cottage is a museum nowadays. You may visit her birthplace. She was the daughter of a clergyman, well, the Yorkshire moors are very wild and romantic setting indeed. Her most important novel is Jane Eyre. It's a fictional autobiography. We shall talk about fictional autobiographies with regard to Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens wrote David Copperfield and Great Expectations, two autobiographical fictions or fictional autobiographies. Jane Eyre is another one. A young woman growing up in a time when the only possibility for a woman to realize herself was marriage. And she meets the wrong one, because the one she marries is already married. He is married to a crazy wife, which he is hiding away in the attic of his house. She sets the house on fire in the course of the novel and burns alive. Rochester, badly injured, can be saved, and Jane and Rochester, after all, come together after the crazy one has burned to death, because the crazy one is the wife he married in his first marriage. So you see, a lot of romantic stuff here. The same applies to Emily Bronte, and that's my last remark for today, because I have to finish Emily Bronte wrote one famous novel, that's Wuthering Heights, tells the stories of two families, the Earnshaws and the Lintons. The novel is especially the tale of Catherine, the older one, and Heathcliff, a boy who was found a foundling in the streets of Liverpool. Here the Industrial Revolution comes poking its nose into the novel. An orphan boy found in the streets of Liverpool, that's Heathcliff. And Catherine and Heathcliff grow up together as sister and brother. Of course they aren't. And they fall in love with each other. Heathcliff is a very rough boy, very rough indeed, has a very rough behavior, but Heathcliff is one of the great romantic, Byronic heroes with a double face, a generous one and a villainous one, as a divided hero like Jekyll and Hyde, you know, and Frankenstein and his monster. They are also two sides of one medal. Well, the story is a tragic one, so we are dealing with a tragic novel in the first half because Catherine dies when she marries Edgar. Edgar is a milksop, not a hero as Heathcliff. And she is sort of torn between two men. Her love for Heathcliff remains eternal while she marries Edgar. So it's a very realistic story. Aren't we all marrying the wrong one? I don't know, how often have you been married? I have been married twice. I should know better. But I keep saying, I love marrying again and again. Yes. Okay, that was my last word for today. Thank you very much for being patient with me and listening. See you in 2 weeks' time.